Okay, so hello and welcome to Facts First PH's research briefing today. This is our sixth. This usually happens every Friday at the same time, but we're doing it earlier this week because it's Holy Week. So I'm your host today, Jello Gonzalez, and we are live now on the Facebook pages of Rappler, Move PH, Newsbreak, as well as on the pages of several other partners of the Facts First PH coalition. So first, a quick introduction of this initiative. Facts First PH is a coalition of more than 100 media and civil society groups coming together and taking a stand to protect the facts and move towards a healthier and safer public space online. So the coalition is composed of several operational layers, all working towards that goal. This weekly research briefing is part of the research layer, wherein research groups conduct an analysis of the data generated through this effort to gain insights on narratives and networks aimed at manipulating the public, especially now ahead of the elections. Our study today: in the post-truth era, news matters more than ever. But what counts as fake news, has become a contentious subject. So part of that is because of these networks of channels on YouTube that pose as news-like sources of information and mimic news content, but at their core push for a certain political agenda. That's what we will be discussing in this study called The Rise of Meta-partisan News Ecosystems on YouTube. So we have Fatima Gaw. She's an assistant professor at the UP Department of Communication Research and the co-convener of the Philippine Media Monitoring Laboratory. Her work centers on the mediation of platforms, algorithms, and digital technologies in culture and politics in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. She has a master's degree in digital communication and culture from the University of Sydney and a bachelor's degree in broadcast communication, magna cum laude, from the University of the Philippines. We also have Ira Cruz. She's an MA Communication graduate student at the UP Department of Communication Research. Aside from being a master's student, she is also a civil servant, researcher, and development worker doing community work in fishing communities. Her research interests include science communication, development communication, and media technology and culture. Last but not the least, we have Luisa Pineda. She's a research assistant at the Philippine Media Monitoring Laboratory of the UP Department of Communication Research. She recently graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a degree in media communication and development. Her research interests include media and disinformation, labor and migration, gender, and climate justice. So we'll also have a Q&A at the end of the briefing. So please write down your questions in our Q&A box so our authors can address them after. So I now give the floor to our presenter, Fatima Gaw.
All right. Can I have a tech check first if you see my slides? Thumbs up, please.
Seeing it.
Correct. All right. Thank you so much, Jello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this briefing. I am Fatima Gaw from the Philippine Media Monitoring Laboratory of the UP Department of Communication Research. And on behalf of my co-authors, Ira Cruz and Luisa Pineda, I will be presenting our very exciting new research on what we call as the meta-partisan news ecosystem on YouTube. So I will explain what this meta-partisan news ecosystem means. I know it's a mouthful, but later on you'll understand why we needed to label our concept as such. So as Jello mentioned earlier, introduced the topic, what news is in nowadays has become a very contentious subject. It's something that is not necessarily something clear in our heads anymore. It's because of these three developments. First is a transformation of news from the print to the online format. It has changed the way we write news. And I know folks from Rappler would really resonate to this because they are aware that news is not just something that is factual. It needs to be engaging as well because of its existence in social media platforms, as well as including our audiences and the way we write our stories by storyfying, for instance, our social media posts. Second, there is the normalization of what we call as the hyper-partisan news, especially in the US. These are kinds of news with extreme political bias, such as the case of Fox News in the US, as I mentioned, and as I will discuss later, SMNI in the Philippines. Third, of course, is fake news, something that is quite infamous already 6 years ago and until now. Also invoking the news genre, despite being the opposite of what traditional news represent, by looking and feeling like real news. So what news is increasingly ambiguous, and it affects how we perceive news in this democracy today. We also want to emphasize that news is also precarious in another sense. Before social media, the circulation of news is wholly controlled by publishers or media outlet. When you buy, a newspaper, the news is not it's not your choice whether the news is in the front page or in elsewhere in the other pages of the newspaper. Now, where news will appear, what audiences will see it, what kind of content is recommended with it is all contingent on these three secondary gatekeepers, which are the platforms, the algorithms, and users. This means that for news to stick, for news to feel like it's serving your interest as a reader, producers of news need to appeal to them as well, not just to the audiences in one way or another. So for all these reasons, it is important to start looking at news sources that are outside of the mainstream media establishment and how they exploit this precarity of the news genre. Our research focused on the specific breed of news producers that arguably are successful in combining online news formats, hyper-partisan messaging, and disinformation on YouTube. Well, many of us here might consider these kinds of videos, as you see on the screen, nuisance. It's just nagugulo lang sila sa diskurso, sa balita. We would say that they are quite powerful in changing our notions of newsness, what is news, as well as fortifying political lies in this election and beyond. We pose this research question: how do these news channels reconfigure manipulative political discourse on YouTube? And we use the word reconfigure specifically because we want to emphasize the transformation of this information and propaganda through the use of news elements. We ask the question, what happens to a lie when you wrap it up in news packaging? Now, for our methods, we derive our data from a larger data set of videos from our Digital Public Pulse project covering the 2022 election YouTube network from May 2021 to Feb 2022. So that's a 10 months period. Of course, we want to complete our study and even analyze those videos until May 2022. From there, we filtered those that are consistently including keywords such as news, balita, just in, all those indicators of newsness in their titles, channel names, and category. And then we map these news channels in our larger election network using social network analysis and determine which communities in the network they belong to. And lastly, we use discourse analysis to interrogate the use of news values and news styles to understand how they shape manipulative discourses in the video. So, as you know, the title of our presentation is Meta-partisan News Ecosystem. What we found is not just that these news channels make manipulative narratives persuasive, because it's something that we know for a fact a couple of years back and with the existing research we have, but it's also how these news channels create a network that cements scheming partisan discourses as formidable counter movement. It's not just, just trolls, or it's not something that you can reject. They're actually, a formidable political movement. And we call this network as the meta-partisan news ecosystem. So this is the part where I explained the meta qualifier. We use the meta qualifier specifically because this network of channels self-produces, self-endorses, and self-references partisan political narratives by both appropriating and perverting news elements to advance politically manipulative discourse. In simple terms, they make news about themselves, their politicians, their political agenda, their political schemes, until they create a coherent political reality that can withstand and coexist with mainstream news media. And that's quite an interesting angle to look at, because even if there's mainstream news media to defend the truth, to uphold facts, they can coexist because they actually latch on the power of news media as well. So we'll walk you through those ideas more later. So let's take a look at these channels within the election network on YouTube. So out of the 3,400 plus channels we have in the network, we identified 124 of these news, quote unquote news. By the way, whenever I talk news here, I always put in quotation marks because we don't want to make judgment on what news is and not, because it's, again, a contentious subject. So please bear with me putting quotation marks in the news. In all these channels, 124 of them, they're not a lot. They're actually just 4% of the network. However, as you can see in the network, in the teal color, hope you can see the visualization here, the teal color shows those news channels. When you look at them, they're not necessarily a minority in this network. They are prominently positioned, they're widely distributed in the network while maintaining a high connective bond with each other, given their high level of connectedness. So what this means is that the algorithm has identified these news channels as having similar topics, formats, and audiences. Because of this, they are likely to be recommended next to each other, forming the backbone of what we call as the meta-partisan news ecosystem. Now, when partitioned to algorithmic communities or groups of channels that are likely to be recommended next to each other, and you see the color of the network change, these news channels actually mostly belong to one major community. That's the one in orange. So the news channels are the ones labeled. I know it's quite small. I can give you a clearer copy of the network after the presentation. And in this community, this news channel actually are connected with partisan entities like SMNI, PTV, Bongbong Marcos, Tony Gonzaga, and Erwin Tulfo. So it's clear that there's a partisan character in their connection. There are some news channels, however, spilling over neighboring communities. So may mga nakita kayo ng mga labels here in the blue corner of the network and the green corner. And that's actually, the blue one is actually mainstream media. And you can see that there are some news channels spilling over there. And then the green one are Marcos Jr. partisan influencers and content creators that we previously reported to be promoting Kalye surveys, claiming that he has a landslide win. So their close proximity with this adjacent community allows them to function as, one, a surrogate to journalistic reporting because they are, in the same community as the mainstream media, and two, because they also are in the other community, or at least side by side with the partisan community of Marcos Jr. They also complement politically charged content. Now that we have a look at how strategically dispersed or positioned these channels are in the network, let's now move on and analyzing how they use the news elements in their content. So in general, the video's use of news values help project the manipulative content as containing information that are of public relevance, even if when you look more closely, or actually not even closely, it's really not. One tactic we see is how the videos manufacture relevance by serving as journalistic extension. So what is this journalistic extension? What this means is that these news channels extend, expound, and expand on topics that are already talked about in mainstream media, often centering on elite actors, the candidates themselves, President Duterte, etc., and public events like debates or rallies. And the way they cover these topics, however, are in a way that's not necessarily of public interest. The topic is relevant, but the way of covering it is not. It's often just politically provocative, that it shocks people, it creates controversy, or that the content is politically beneficial to that political camp. For instance, in this Duterte News Report video, so note the name of the channel, News Report video, Duterte News Report. They latch on public interest on the Marcos disqualification case in COMELEC to amplify Sara Duterte's statement, denying the merits of the case and condemning the opposition to it. In fact, I will read the statement. Nanindigan din si Sara na walang basihan ng lahat ng disqualification cases laban kay Marcos na ayon sa kanya ay kagagawa ng mga taong desperadong makabalik sa kapangyarihan. So there's that jab to the opposition here. The statement doesn't really add anything to the discourse because it's been dealt with, but it's portrayed as an important standalone news story. So it extends the story to give a platform for their political agenda. Another way for these news channels to function as journalistic extension is literally extending news footage in their channel. They repose, curate, and edit the content to favor their political agenda. What's interesting is that they particularly upcycle the content, meaning it's posted already elsewhere, but they upcycle it again, put it up again by reposting it in their channel. And the upcycling of content actually happens within the Meta-partisan news ecosystem. So in the example we have here, we have this channel, Idol Kaloy, reposting the influencer Banat Bay. So we know him as a known Duterte ally, in his commentary in his page. And then there's this channel named Showbiz Fanatics, placing an edited footage of the vlogger Thinking Pinoy, another known Duterte ally before, but now I think he is moving on to the Marcos camp in the video. So there is that upcycling of content that's happening that makes it, extending news elsewhere. If we were to call these content news. Now, another tactic that involves creating newsworthiness is the use of affect or emotion, using the news values of positivity, negativity, superlativeness, and unexpectedness. The choices of words to use, the visuals, and the information sources that they selected all shape how we will emotionally respond to a video. What we saw in our investigation is that the use of drama, exaggeration, and claims of representing majority opinion can make the news content appeal to the audiences. So in this video by Showbiz Fanatics, an unknown voiceover comments the supposed description of this interview. Makapagdamdamin na pahayag ng dating Senador Bongbong Marcos na hinangaan ng maraming netizen matapos ang naging one-on-one talk with Boy Apunta. So there's that, claim that a lot of people actually liked the interview. It was praised, and there was, this proof, a number of views that the video garnered after 12 hours. But we know, of course, that views can be manipulated. So, but the fact that they are able to show that proof, the views, as a lot of people subscribing to it, it is emotionally moving to see that a lot of people actually watch this piece of content. The third tactic involves performing newsworthiness, not to the audience per se, but to the platform. So as I've said earlier, the platform decides whether or not you appear in the search results or the recommendation list. So it's an important arbiter of your visibility. This news channel know how to do that by using keywords, tags, and hashtags in our video. And we have this over-the-top example of using so much hashtag to game the algorithm. The news channels also regularly release timely content related to the elections or the election events. So for example, the CNN debate just happened, they would automatically release a reaction video right after that. And the last one would be using the live or reaction format, and that essentially lets them latch on trending topics. So I want you to imagine it as the same way when you watch a movie trailer that was just released and you get a recommendation of a reaction video reacting to this trailer. So it's the same thing because it attaches itself to a more popular content. So if one of these channels, again, claim to report about a debate or an interview, it will appear together with that original clip that you watched on YouTube. So all of these news values make their content newsworthy, even if it's not really of public interest or public value to us. Now, when we talk about the news values, the content of the videos, we move on to news styles, where we see the use of news styles as positioning the news channels as alternative sources of news and information without necessarily delivering actual news content. I know it might be ridiculous to hear it's a source of information and news, but without delivering news, and I'll explain why is this so. So one strategy used by these channels is the use of audiovisual and textual cues that are traditionally associated with broadcast news media. And they use this to invoke what we call as journalistic authority, because journalists and news media has this ascendancy of doing this standardized kind of reporting, rigor in their research, etc. In this example from PH News Recap, you can see the use of broadcast character generator or CharGen for our media students and practitioners. There are news crawlers as well, at the bottom. And if you go to the video, of course, I'm not able to embed it here, you would actually hear a reporter-like voiceover delivering the news. So mukha talaga siyang news, right? And all of these signals, audiovisual, textual signals, denote that the content of the news is significant, impactful, or even timely. Increasingly, this packaging of news has become more realistic than just haphazardly, putting, a label or a headline to a news or annotating the video. So it has become more professional somehow, as you can see in our example. Where it becomes perverted is in its use of textual cues, which is characterized by biased framing, vulgarity, and incoherence. For instance, in another Duterte news report video, the headline contains expletives against VP Leni Robredo. Where on earth will you see news that contains expletive, right? Unless it's a quote, which reads, "Kilalang direktor, sinupalpal si Robredo, palpak kang bruha ka lugaw." There is this dissonance between the formality of the look of the news with the annotation and with the jargon and the vulgarity of the content of the news, as you can read or hear them when you watch the video. It doesn't follow the conventions of accuracy, fairness, and professionalism, but it suspends our judgment that this content, might be considered news because of its news-like appearance. It doesn't help that tabloid media kind of looks like this as well, but yeah, it is that dissonance between the formalities of the look and feel of the news and what the contents of the news really is. Other use of news styles that I already hinted earlier is the use of footage and experts from elsewhere. But what I want to emphasize in the news style section of our presentation is not simply the upcycling of content, but its value as a proxy evidence in the absence of facts, proofs, and documentation. So the news clips are used as the evidence instead of actually presenting evidence. In almost all of the news channels we investigate, they use SMNI as their preferred news source, alleging that it has no bias, even if we know that the owner, the broadcaster, and the people they're guesting in their shows have overt partisan bias. Now, we also see the use of content from government sources like PCOO and RTV Malacanang, and even interviews with government officials and known political allies. So here in the example of Idol Caloy, a senatorial candidate rather, in the Marcos late Larry Gadon is a guest in SMNI, in an SMNI interview with Mike Abe. So there's that combination of, known political allies and a partisan news channel here. These channels also use news clippings from mainstream media like CNN, GMA News, ABS-CBN, but it is often times the case that to ridicule and discredit the news outfit. So when there are favorable details in their reporting, the channels are used to cherry pick selectively or highlight details in the videos, but more often than not, the footage are used to criticize the media. So what they do is claim that the media is not credible, their integrity has been compromised because of their critical reporting of politicians, as if critical reporting is bad, right? And what's alarming is that some of these clips are actually manipulated. So on screen, you would see the CNN newscast, and it was edited to lead to an unknown website. So you can see here, news.ph, even if it's CNN, and CNN has their own website, right? So it is, editing this footage to look like the piece of content actually comes from them or from another source, not from CNN. Okay. Apart from audiovisual and textual styles, the source of choices and the news channels also have discursive styles that reveal patterns of extreme bias and fabricated information. So there are falsehoods that are repeatedly mentioned in this content, even if it's, again, repeatedly debunked already by fact checks, such as ABS-CBN's failure to pay their taxes. That's why their franchise wasn't renewed. Another falsehood would be Robredo running under the Liberal Party, even if she is an independent. So persistent misrepresentation of the speech and action of political candidates were also salient in the videos, such as, for example, saying that, and here in the photo, exactly, in Idol Caloy's video, they insinuate that Robredo and Pacquiao are actually really asking for advanced questions, even if there's no evidence as such. And the original footage of Professor Carlos here didn't really name anyone, but the video named somebody. So it was consistently falsehood and didn't have evidence to support their claim. Okay, so both the news values and news styles legitimize the content as news, even if arguably it's not necessarily at par the standards of news we know. These channels employ manipulation strategies as well to crystallize the political propaganda and disinformation. So not only are they advancing manipulative discourse, not only deceiving people, but as a product of the many channels that echo each other's narrative, they prescribe a partisan lens or a way of looking at the world and interpreting political events and issues that make the viewer susceptible to dismissing evidence, evading logic, and rationalizing misconduct. And I'm not going to discuss here the individual lies or falsehood in the videos, because I think that those lies are not new. It's something that we've seen before. But what I'm going to unpack in the next couple of slides is that those strategies that really transform these lies into truths, at least in their own ecosystem. So one key strategy is the invocation of moral ascendancy of these politicians and their political agenda. So their video alleged that the political actions and decisions of their endorsed political actors are politically just or tama, and are based on genuine intent, moral judgment, and careful consideration. It's really out of the goodness of their heart. It's really out of their love for the Philippines. That's the kind of rhetoric at play here. For instance, a video of Showbiz Chicadoro features the blogger Sas Sasot, who justifies Sara Duterte's decision to run as VP and not as president. Because if you remember, Sara was polling, quite well as president in the earlier polling, in the earlier surveys. So I quote, "Sara wants to learn, get more adept at being a leader, build her own political kingdom, and not simply inherit it from her father." So that's the explanation that Sasa Sot is offering. Instead of this, running for the VP as a calculated political scheme, as most political schemes are. So this is the kind of moral ascendancy that these videos claim. And I think it's not enough to elevate the morality of their endorsed candidates and politicians. It's also important for the videos to position their competition and opposition as morally corrupt. The opposite of the moral ascendancy that the politicians that they endorse have. So these morally corrupt politicians are malicious, deceitful, incompetent in many ways. For instance, when you look at this Banat Balita channel, it showcases SMNI commentator Mike Abe again, who asked, "Tawagin nyo magnanakaw si BBM? Bakit? May ebidensya ba kayo?" Tapos sabihin nyo, karapatan nyong ilabas ang saloobin nyo. So he's trying to say that claims or accusations of Marcos being a magnanakaw is a malicious accusation. It's not based on evidence. He's questioning the existence of evidence, even if we know that there's a lot of evidence out there. So by using moral justifications, the videos are able to rationalize falsehood and factual distortion in the face of well-documented evidence and overt politicking. Now, the second one that we saw a lot in our video is the vilification of enemies, particularly opposing political actors, mainstream news, political institutions, and activist groups. They are considered enemies, not just, competition, because they allegedly are the ones to be blamed for what the country has become. They're the problem of the country, essentially. And they are discredited, maligned, and assigned fault at the expense of the supposed politician or of the public. So, ganito yung mga rhetoric nila. Dahil sa media, hindi nagawa ni President Duterte ang trabaho niya. Dahil sa mga NPA, walang kapayapaan sa probinsya. That's the kind of vilification that they do. In this Ako Pinoy video here, the influencer Banat Bay accuses survey firms of purposely releasing survey results that show President Duterte as declining in survey polling as VP when he was still, mulling over the decision of running for VP. He said and claimed that merong nagpapamind control na si Pangulong Duterte wag tumakbong VP because of the supposed timing of the release of the survey. So very interesting that they are putting down in survey results and also, using survey results when it's useful for them. There's also instances of the candidates being undermined, especially the opposition or not the opposing candidates or politicians running for office. So the often victim here is Lenny Robredo and Manny Pacquiao. So in this video of PH Latest, there's an unknown host. Di siya nag-introduce, just an host there looking like, legit studio. He undermines the accomplishment of VP Robredo by asking, ang dami niyo na palang nagawa, bakit hindi bilib ang mga tao? Referring to her polling performance. Another video that we saw, whatever accomplishments VP Robredo had from before in her stint as congresswoman in Naga, they also attribute to Jessie Robredo and not to her. So there's that erasure of her accomplishment. So ultimately, by framing these actors and institutions as enemies, not only of particular politicians, but also of the public, the channels can dismiss the former's truth claims as ill intent or malicious or born out of ineptitude, di niya alam yung ginagawa niya, while helping the hero politician maneuver and deflect legitimate criticism and allegation. Because again, they have enemies. They have to fight the enemies. That's why they're doing these kinds of things. Now, ito yung pinaka-potent sa lahat, and I hope this is something that resonates with what you've been seeing around. What makes this information ultimately powerful is the promise of political enlightenment. These videos make the public believe that they are victims of a political system or a conspiracy, and that these alternative news channels can help them know the truth or ang katotohanan. The videos first establish this conspiracy, this cover-up, and start demolishing the stability of facts and historical accounts from there to denialism and distortions. For example, there were claims of deceit or mapanlinlang na 1986 EDSA revolution by an unknown voice, purportedly echoing comments of political scientist Clarita Carlos. There's also claims that, Marcos ill-gotten wealth, dismissed na ang kaso na yon, therefore it's not something that is true anymore. It erases that accusation. There were also claims of wala namang yung mga sinasabing martial law victims, wala naman, in another Idol Kaloy video. So there's that claim of denialism and distortion once you have established that, people are being fooled all this time, and therefore you need to watch our videos to know the truth. These channels convince viewers that by subscribing to a narrative of the video, they're able to open their eyes na mulat sa katotohanan. And social media was central to that, apart from, in conflict with what they hear in books and historians. This is also a further invitation to viewers to subscribe to their channels, manood ka nitong channel ko, yung next video ko, yung ibang channel speaking of the same truth, and similar accounts that could, possibly align with their political agenda. So in particular, this Boy Abunda interview was really used to as a propaganda tactic to invite people to see Marcos. And I quote, "Milyong-milyong Pilipino ay nagpapasalamat kay Boy Abunda na nakapagbukas ng isipan ng maraming mamamayan kung sino ang dapat iboto." Okay. So, I know it's a long presentation already, but I need to walk you through the news values, news styles, and manipulative discourse because it explains how together they facilitate the creation and maintenance of this meta-partisan news ecosystem. So the news values serve as an entry point, as a gateway to the ecosystem by manufacturing newsworthiness that call viewers to consume the video, even if it doesn't directly, affect their public life. And even if, the video contains little to none that would be of public interest. So it normalizes hyper-partisan inflammatory content as something newsworthy. And, it's very, it's scary because yung mga ganung kind of content, as you saw, yung mga inflammatory headline, it's something that people might have considered news nowadays because it's being normalized. Now, once you're inside the ecosystem, if, for example, you clicked on one of the partisan news videos earlier that we saw, it is the aesthetic and discursive news styles that lend the content a legitimacy and, in its reappropriated form, the authenticity to engage and captivate audiences. By remaining to be amateur because they're not necessarily institutional media or they're not professional, but they borrow the professionalness of the visual, oral, and performative codes of mainstream media, the news channels occupy an inviting middle ground, especially for audiences who might develop ambivalence already or skepticism of mainstream media. Now, the last component of the ecosystem is the manipulative discourse, functioning as a schematic anchor from which to interpret, evaluate, and respond to political messages in action. The news channels are recommended next to each other, and they cultivate a hyper-partisan political worldview. Itong pagtingin ko sa realidad. And it categorically rejects particular factual information that is dissonant to that narrative, and only leverage on the factual information that helps them. And ultimately, those cherry picking of truth is in tandem with their own falsehood, and they consider that as ground truth. So the meta-partisan ecosystem together stabilizes this political reality such that no amount of fact-checking can unravel this convoluted lie built through its multitude of manipulative scaffoldings. And now, I hope it's very clear to us all why it's called meta, or why we call it meta. It's simply because that the lies and the lies and perversions of other politically aligned media channels, sources, and output, or sources and channels. Ultimately, it's one lie as the basis for the lie, the next lie that they want to perpetuate. And the question that's always asked with this to us, this information researcher, is why is this information so difficult to address or to answer? And this is exactly that. That's why we're quite excited about this research. This meta-partisan news ecosystem is so self-reliant; it doesn't need anyone else because it creates its own untruths and controversy. It doesn't really rely on other stories out there. And it's also self-sustaining because it augments, extends, and magnifies the same narratives into new ones. So one lie after another, combine that together, and it's amplified and magnified further. So what happens now? When one of these claims, one of these lies become immune to fact-checking, empirical evidence, and logical explanation, it will become the foundation from which the rest of the lies and perversion can stand and withstand scrutiny. So this is very troubling because there are certain falsehood in this election period and before that is actually accepted as truth for particular audiences, and that becomes the foundation of all the other lies that follows. Now, it's that gray area that is really troubling us here, and what we want to imbibe in our viewers today is the increasingly nebulous definition of news by the exploitation of political actors to manufacture their own partisan news to counter free and fair election discourse. And once this gray area is manipulated or exploited, I think we need to think differently about how we want to approach news making or news storytelling. We need to move past, fake news because it's not anymore a productive label. We need to acknowledge that there's sophistication in hijacking the news genre. And I think if we are to, explain the concrete takeaway here, what we can pick up is two things. Either news organizations themselves uphold that what kinds of news stories should be considered news, really defend the news genre, or that they can also leverage this gray area to change the convention of news. Perhaps how news is being done is not anymore suitable in this new media environment. So we need to adapt and also, exploit the same gray area that that political actors with vested interests are exploiting. And the second thing we want to emphasize here is that the meta-partisan ecosystem is a complex architecture. It's an architecture. It's not just one video, and it's a product of years of economic investment, political schemes, and platform manipulation. So what we want to share today is that through the concept of the meta-partisan news ecosystem, we shift our interest from fact-checking to ecosystem tracing, where you can fact-check later on, to materialize the orchestrated manipulation of public discourse, not only by debunking one lie after another, but also exposing the schematics, the blueprint of manipulation that operate our disinformation machinery. So that's it for us today. We are now opening the floor for questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Fatima. So it's almost like just a few years back, there was this proliferation of websites that almost look like news websites, right? And now it's only gotten more sophisticated, moving on to YouTube and these videos that take on these visual cues. So yeah, um, I always ask this after every research briefing. So what drove you to look at this part of the this information ecosystem for your research?
I've seen this before. It's just I didn't have to do research about it. Now there was an
Mhm.
opportunity because it was again recurring in the election data set we had. So it was something that I think needed to be interrogated because I'm really annoyed with how people use fake news. It's just plastered all over
Mhm.
social media, and it's politicized as well. You know, Marcos Jr. claims to be a victim of fake news himself. So it's very much politicized anymore. We need a new language to introduce the sophistication of this. That's why we introduce again another sophisticated term. I know it's not super catchy yet, but that's essentially encompassing what we intend to show, that meta-ness of partisan and disinformation content online. And I want to pass on the floor to my co-authors here on what interested them in this research topic. Ira first, go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So, for me, actually, it's quite what interested me. What interests me to pursue this study. It's because that these channels they already have formed this type of ecosystem wherein this type of shared reality has become a significant truth among those followers and viewers of their channel. So it is quite alarming. It as compared to for example the 2016 elections, that there are certain sites only on Facebook or on Twitter that has these partisan channels. But this election, these 2022 elections, it's alarming that they have expanded their networks to the point that these channels employed already a host and upcycled different associated videos from mainstream media. And since with that alarm that we researchers felt, I think there is a need to expose the tactics that these channels use to present themselves as news, wherein in fact it's they just contain a fabricated information and partisanship, and also as well lies and distortion of journalistic authority. Yes,
Hi, good
thank you.
morning. So, what interested me also in this particular research was the fact that we didn't have a name yet for what meta-partisan was. And as we were discussing this as a team, it was really interesting as well to go through the process of, okay, these channels are actually self-referencing and self-endorsing. And that's what drew me into this research, is the fact that we have the concept of journalistic extension, which was discussed by Fatima earlier, and you see this a lot as well. Way back, news has done this by extending their news through commentaries and such. But what makes this ecosystem different from the rest is the fact that they're able to repost, repackage, upcycle content in whatever way suits them. And at the same time, when they put this all together, it's usually from the same channels that we've seen in the network visualized earlier in the presentation. So I think that's what drew me as well to this research, and we're happy with what we've come up so far.
Okay. So this, this ability to coalesce into a network, to kind of put people into an echo chamber. What kind of role do you think YouTube played in this, and what do you think YouTube must do? Because there's always this criticism that YouTube has not been looked at as much as we've looked at Facebook, even though Facebook still has a lot of problems. So let's focus on YouTube as a platform and its effects on allowing these kinds of networks to prosper?
Actually, YouTube is the largest platform in 2021, and I assume in 2022 as well, in the Philippines. So it has surpassed Facebook already. So there should be scholarly interest in interrogating YouTube. But I think YouTube is like any other channel. As long as there's no public pressure to do anything, they won't really do anything. The fact that, I've done research before for the Marcos disinformation ecosystem of historical revisionism. We raised this before to them. There are historical distortionist content out there and it's racking up views. We reported a list of channels to them. They didn't do anything. And now, I remember the start of the election season, they were saying, oh, you are serious in battling, disinformation on YouTube. That's why we're banning political ads and focusing on our efforts to, govern or moderate content. But we're not seeing that. And for me, counterproductive pa nga yung banning of political ads because you're removed, the avenue to legitimately do political campaigning and you pushed everyone underground. And then, to engage in this, malicious or, insidious attempt to shape political discourse. So I don't think YouTube has done anything meaningful. And I'm sorry to say this upfront. I think there are more meaningful ways to engage, especially using empirical based research like ours to think about, again, not just fact checking, not just reporting this individual video and taking it down. It's just one of the hundreds. And I forgot to mention, we found 124 channels, but the videos that we found are 500 plus, at least in the past 10 months. That's a lot of videos. And assuming each video has, let's say 50,000 views, that's multiplied to 500. That's really a lot. So I don't think we have realized the size of the problem yet. That's why we're not acting on it in a meaningful way.
Okay, so we need more people looking into YouTube and just to
power.
tackle this. Yes,
yeah,
right.
Really, for
political will.
Yeah, for us to be taken seriously, because the thing is, we're a third world country. We're not necessarily in the economic center of the world, but we are the number one social media users in the world. So we need to be in the spotlight as well.
All right, so we have a question from our audience. I'll get to it. May I ask what would be the weakness of this meta-partisan news ecosystem? What would it take to dismantle this? And what would be the effect of dismantling the system on how the public views news?
Ako, napakahirap na question.
Right.
The thing is, these news, the thing is not Marcos Jr. using it the first time around. It's been the administration, been there since 2016. They got a lot of subscribers already, hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So it's really hard to dismantle this ecosystem. And for me, if we are thinking about this as an industrial complex, it's really cutting making the roots of the problem and discovering them and eventually policing them. So number one is the money circulating in the ecosystem that's still unknown to journalists, to researchers. As long as there's money in that industry, that posting this partisan news ecosystem is financially beneficial, it's profitable for me, I will continue doing this. There's incentive to do so. And the platforms also need to act on this. They need to change their approach of treating this information as a case-to-case basis. Ganun kasi sila eh. One video, we will study it, then we'll take down. One video ulit, nangyari repeated offense of a channel, will warn the channel. But the thing is, again, it's an ecosystem. It's hundreds of them. So wala, 2023, 24 pa tayo matatapos dito. So there's not really. I don't know how to answer it. Maybe my co-authors have better ideas here. But for me, it's cutting the investment, the capital there, and making sure that this is something that has a lot more disincentive than incentive.
If I may add to Ms. Fatima, I think to dismantle this meta-partisan news ecosystem, of course, I agree with Ms. Fatima that it is very hard and it will not be easy. But the thing is, it is important that given the empirical data and evidence that we have in this research, it is important that we expose them. And then, of course, along with exposing them is intensify the fact-checking mechanisms by media organizations and other institutions. And as well as when it comes to education, since we have a K-12 system, and there's also a need to intensify and strengthen the media literacy subjects in senior high school so that the students will be able to discern, not just to discern the content that they consume on social media and media, not just passively consuming them and then believing them, but also to be critical in consuming those information that we saw in media and social media. Yes, thank you.
To add to my co-authors, I guess it's to circle back to the previous question. It's also a job, I think, for a lot of social media platforms and media platforms like YouTube to be able to figure out how to best go about problems faced by these kinds of scenarios, especially with the algorithm, and how these platforms are able to, and these channels rather, are able to game the algorithm. And I think one key reason why we must do this, especially, is because aside from, let's say, the political, the economic, and the social investment placed into these types of media content, the types of channels, there's a lot of emotional investment here. And there's a lot of emotional investment, not only on the part of the people orchestrating these schemes online, but also the way they're able to pull people is something that we should also think about. The emotional investment, the affective element here that draws people to listen to this news and to be able to, I guess, I don't want to say the word, sucked into a sort of echo chamber of sorts. So I think those are 2 points I also want to highlight.
Yes. So it's really gotten more sophisticated now that sometimes just simple content moderation seems a little lacking. Just we have to look at the system, the surveillance capitalism, and all those money systems involved in these platforms. Okay, so we have another question from our audience. They're a student journalist. The post-truth era is something I've always wanted to write about. Do you guys have any advice for student journalists in dealing with these alternative media sources? Or just any general tips on managing through the post-truth era?
Yeah. Parang yung journalist natin ngayon, lahat kalaban nila. It seems like, apart from the danger of being a journalist in the Philippines, it's also that the audiences might not believe you anymore because there are those alternative sources. I think the answer is, two-pronged for me. One is really strengthening, practicing journalism as as the standards of journalism should be. I know because of the digital economy, we're forced to write clickbaity headlines, we're forced to write content that would just drive traffic, but not of public interest. So I think it's important to uphold the standards of journalistic practice as we know it. At the same time, we need to evolve from that. So how do we uphold those values while also being adaptable to the new media environment of engaging your audiences? Because I think one of the reasons why there's ambivalence to journalism and media, news media in particular, is because we've lost touch. We've lost touch with audiences. They feel neglected. Their issues are not talked about. The resentment of capitalism or the government or this environment is not addressed. So I think ultimately we need to have a more bottom-up approach and reporting, not necessarily it's not parang basically kung news values of eliteness tells us, okay, just report, government or celebrities, those who are in the elite position in society. Perhaps it's about flipping them and still using eliteness, but make the issues of the people, the elite issue to talk about instead. So that's for me a bit idealistic, but something that you can do and use it as a guiding principle.
Yes, I also agree with Miss Fatima. As a former campus journalist and one of my jobs before, also prior to becoming a civil servant, is also a journalist. It's to uphold the values and integrity as a journalist that we've learned in schools, that we've learned from our mentors, and that is the value of professionalism, integrity, um, yung non-partisanship. Given our society nowadays na we're under the pandemic, no, we're suffering from this what we call infodemic. And yes, we're already under this post-truth era. But yes, I think those values that we learned from schools and our mentors are very important as we traverse this new generation era of wherein alternative sites and fabricated information are just sprouting everywhere, just like mushroom. And yes.
I guess my advice for student journalists is to keep it up, but also know what is out there. Get out, get to know as much as you can. I think without us, I think it's important that we are able to label and identify what type of news genres are out there. And I think that's why we put so much value in research like this, especially with the Philippine Media Monitoring Lab. And by knowing what's out there, by knowing what types of news sources or alternative news sources you may call it, or what meta-partisan news ecosystems are out there, you would be able to channel the right kind of, or what you believe is the right journalistic standard for you. And by knowing and identifying what are these sources that may, I guess, not be emulated or emulated, I think that's also important, because I guess without this kind of research, we might not be able to see what's actually out there on YouTube, Facebook, or other platforms. But it's important to get to know what's out there.
All right, thank you. So there's another question from the audience. Do we have data on who the audience is, the demographics of the frequent viewers of these videos that you were able to study? Who are they trying? Are they reaching out to a particular audience?
Yeah. In general, the social media landscape is called post-demographic, because we don't really care about what age they are, their location in terms of engagement online. So if we were to answer the question, we really need data directly from YouTube to identify, okay, we'll pass on the list to YouTube. What are these, who are watching these channels? Maybe it's a particular demographic segment might be susceptible to this information to begin with. So that's the reality. YouTube has to supply that data. But I think in terms of demographic, it's not necessarily demographic. Maybe it's more psychographic, as marketers would call it. It's more of who is the most marginalized by mainstream media, who is marginalized by mainstream political discourse, that would, find these alternative news sources as really resonating to their feelings, to their aspirations, to their resentment. The fact that these videos promise a lot of political enlightenment. Sino ba yung nakaka-feel na, niloko ako ng society? Sino ba yung susceptible to that kind of messaging? Maybe that's the one we need to talk about, rather than, demographic identification of who watches this video. But of course, it wouldn't hurt to know. So calling on YouTube to, provide this data. So other researchers, maybe not us, other researchers can extend this research further.
Yes, the platforms need to open up their data to researchers more, right? And so aside from being in a post-truth era, we're also in a post-demographic era. Correct. Okay. Okay, so I guess just one last question before we end on the part of the individual. What can they do to protect themselves. Parang they're falling to the myths of doing their own research or finding out about the real truth. It's almost like there's some psychological trick at play here, as if it's luring the audience to some kind of forbidden knowledge, an exclusive and enlightened group that is tricked to feel like they know more than most. Eh. Parang may ganun siyang appeal minsan. Eh.
There's you're
Like,
in the
yeah.
book. You're part of the club of these people who know better, right?
Yeah.
I think, echoing what Luisa said, ultimately it's, emotion, and in particular I think it's the sense of belonging. The thing with this meta-partisan, ecosystem, it's not just about, the narratives, but what kind of identity is being formed here. And I remember from, in my undergrad years, the discussion of identity, your personal identity, is always hinged on your social identity. So once this, group of news channels actually tell you that you belong with us, that you are part of the majority of Filipinos who's fed up with the system, and we echo what you believe and we echo your sentiment, there's that sense of belonging. Kumbaga, you can expect audiences to defend these news channels because they feel like they are the ones who really serve their interests. So I think I assume the thing is, this individual, if you're already part of this meta-partisan ecosystem, it's really hard to get out. So I don't think actually that the burden to fix this, or to find solutions to this, is in the individual. The audiences, the viewers of these videos are equally, the ones that are vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. So I think institutional talaga yung solution, and I call on our news media practitioners, our historical institutions, our many other people, or NGO perhaps, who defend or try to uphold the truth. Perhaps it's time to reach out to these audiences. It's not the audiences reaching out to the right sources of information, but it's us reaching out to them. And I've seen a lot of creative uses, creative strategies to do this. Like, if these channels mimic how news media looks like, with the twist, gayahin natin sila, then we can penetrate this ecosystem. So there are creative and subversive solution out there. Might need more investment, and maybe going down the pedestal to achieve what we want to achieve here.
All right. So we're about to end, but do we have final statements from Ira, Luisa?
Sige.
Yeah.
Maybe Luisa first, Ira, and then me, so we can see how we wrap up the session.
So I think to wrap up, I'd like to also partly address the question and the Q&A that just got through. Do you think there should be stronger censoring fake news or dubious claims or posts before it reaches the public? But we would also like to say that there have been a lot of efforts as well, but maybe not enough. We can also talk about that when it comes to taking down posts on social media. And for YouTube in particular, what makes this meta-partisan news ecosystem so sophisticated, so potent, is the fact that they're able to edit and are able to self-reference and self-endorse. So that means that even if a video gets taken down, there is a high chance that that particular snippet or clip in that video is found in other videos that are still up there. So let us be wary as well that this is really, like we discussed earlier, very sophisticated. And in order to probably arm ourselves with adequate tools and media literacy to know what types of sources to believe in. But at the same time, by labeling these types of news, by identifying these types of news, and I hope that we call on more researchers and journalists look into these types of meta-partisan news ecosystems, so that in the future we would be able to find solutions to combat them.
Yes. In addition to what Luisa said, given the extent of the influence and the influence and expansion of these meta-partisan news channels in YouTube, that is also being spread not just in YouTube but also in other social media sites. the courage or the move to debunk these lies that have created a shared reality among those their audience or their followers will be not easy. And aside from calling on researchers also to conduct research, further research on the disinformation, I think we should also do our part. And if we know someone who is being a member or being penetrated by those meta-partisan news, it's not that hard naman to talk to them or just to nakausapin sila and then tell the reality about these sites. And but that doesn't mean that we are pushing na okay, you kumalas ka na dyan with that certain group, with that YouTube community, but also to facilitate them to become a critical thinker and also to discern, to have a discernment so that they will be able to combat fake news and disinformation, especially in this post-truth era.
All right. So I echo my co-authors' points here. Luisa saying that, taking down this content might not be useful because it's going to appear anyway. It's like a parasite, just multiplying and, amplifying, parang COVID in one sense. Then Ira said it's about, reaching outside of the ecosystem because it's a YouTube ecosystem. We have lives outside of YouTube. So we can definitely, circumvent the limitations of this ecosystem. What I want to impart again, and maybe it's self-promotional, we need to move past these terms, fake news, hyper-partisan news, because it's so sophisticated nowadays. So maybe you can pick up the word meta-partisan news. Maybe that's the new buzzword that is more useful to explaining the sophistication of this information out there. And we need, again, to put that ecosystem perspective in place. It's not about asking what the lie is, but where's the lie spreading? Who's echoing these lies? Who's corroborating these lies? Maybe it's about who. It's not anymore about what the lie is.
Okay. Thank you very much again for your hard work, Luisa, Ira, and Fatima. And with that, we'll be ending our research briefing. But we'll have for more details on factsfirst.ph, please check out our website, factsfirst.ph. And we also have tip lines for submission of posts containing dubious claims on Viber and or Messenger. The fact-checking layer of this initiative will verify these claims and publish reports debunking lies or misleading information. For groups interested, they may reach out to #FactsFirst by sending an email to info@factsfirst.ph. So see you next week for our 7th Facts First PH research briefing. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you po. Salamat.